Morning, everyone. This is Jung, the session chair. We have a plenary session. You're a little bit behind the schedule. So without further ado, let me start this plenary session. As you can see, the session is about the green growth. Yeah, and we have three eminent speakers from US, Europe, and Korea. Let me first introduce James McFarland from US, right? The US EPA, and Rob Dellink from OECD, and our famous professor from Korea, KAIST, Professor Jiyong. So we have three speakers and roughly 1 hour. So let's say 15-minute maximum each. And then we have floor discussion within 15 minutes. Yeah. So let's start from Jay first.
Slides are coming up. Is there a, there we go. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I will set my timer here. All right. Thank you so much. It was great to be here. Thanks to the organizers and for setting up the session. I am delighted to be here. I'm Jim McFarland. I'm with the United States Environmental Protection Agency in the Climate Change Division. And I was asked to present because Sergei Paltsev, who is a former colleague at MIT, couldn't quite make it, so happy to jump in. What I'm going to talk to you about today is U.S. federal climate actions, and then link that, how that links to green growth, and then I'll link that to integrated assessment modeling and some future modeling needs. So first of all, just to talk about green growth. Again, like, you know, the plenary session, the title talked about the linkage between both economic development, but also being considerate of the environment and ecological considerations. And this, you know, the green growth concept has a lot of ties to like neoclassical economics when we think about externalities. And the quote I have at the bottom is from the 26th president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, who was a big conservationist. And one of the things that he's talking about in that quote is leaving the natural ecosystems in a place that's better for future generations. And so I think everyone knows that we're not doing that with the atmosphere right now. But hopefully we're working to improve that. My talk is going to focus on 4 different areas within the U.S. federal government and how the U.S. federal government is promoting green growth and green growth concepts. And then I'm going to talk through about what are the implications for what the federal government is doing for the types of integrated assessment modeling that I think we need to be doing to provide a more sustainable transition, at least for the United States. So talking about a few programmatic activities, there's a lot of different ways to think about green growth, but one of the things that the federal government does is we have a lot of programs, a lot of different agencies that try to promote green growth. And so one of the programs that the Environmental Protection Agency has, it's a program called Smart Growth. And essentially it's an outreach program to help communities develop with a view toward the future of protecting the ecology and improving clean air and improving the water. And so a lot of things they focus on are really developing toolkits that can help communities when they're going through planning sessions to adopt better technologies or planning processes that allow them to better deal with, for example, stormwater runoff or to promote cover cropping, nutrient management, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the process of farming and agricultural practices. So again, nothing earth-shattering here, but there's a lot of the outreach types of programs that are being done. One of the big things that the Biden administration has really focused on is going back to natural capital accounting. And this is something that was started a decade ago. It kind of fell by the wayside, and the Biden administration has really done a good job to try to bring that back to front and center. And so in 2023, they started to try to look at how we would add valuing land, air, water, and other natural assets. And there's like a 10-year plan to implement all of this. And it's similar to a lot of other things that are being done, like at the UN, and also the US is participating in a combined process with Australia and Canada to do similar systems of national accounts. Why it's relevant to green growth is because it really provides a better accounting of the natural ecosystems in a way that's monetizing it, but it also allows you to track that ecosystem over time. And so you can understand, from year to year, decade to decade, is the ecosystem services, are they being enhanced like President Roosevelt suggested, or are they deteriorating? And Sergey required me to LinkedIn to MIT work a few times, at least during the presentation. So there's MIT came out with a paper about, a little over almost 10 years ago, expanding the social accounting matrix to include recreation, health, air pollution, and the like in a modeling system. And so that ties into a lot of the types of work that we do in this community. Now I want to turn to talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the CHIPS and Science Act, because these were three different policies that really have changed the game in the US in terms of the level of investment that the US is making in clean growth strategies. And so to start off with the Inflation Reduction Act, this was something that was passed in 2022, the largest act in US history. And, the outlays for this program are range from around $400 billion to upwards of $1 trillion over a 10-year period. So a substantial level of investment supporting wind and solar, supporting electric vehicles, also supporting domestic manufacturing. And it provides a lot of incentives for onshoring, good jobs, high-paying jobs with apprenticeship bonuses and union bonuses. And it also funds a lot of cross-cutting activities. The important thing about that is it's not only trying to get the US to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also doing it in a way that is providing jobs. And then we also had the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the CHIPS and Science Act. That provided a lot of support for onshoring semiconductor manufacturing, as well as support for EV charging infrastructure. So really trying to set the stage for a clean energy transition. And so how's that been going? It's really been pretty remarkable. The level of investment, this is work from the Rhodium Group and the MIT CEPR Group. And so, essentially over the last 4 years, we practically doubled the amount of investment that you're seeing in clean technology. And it's really taken off, started in 2021, but really grown in 2022 and 2023. So with over $490 billion investment since Q2 of 2022, right after sort of the passage of the Infrastructure Law and the CHIPS Act. And quarterly investments have continued to increase quarter by quarter for the past 14 quarters. So really substantial levels of investment. The amount of public investment we're seeing is also substantial. So $630 billion already, and that's distributed widely across the United States. So, basically there's not an area of the country with a decent sized population that hasn't been affected by one of these three pieces of legislation. In terms of private investment, again, this is covering not only clean energy, but also semiconductors and battery manufacturing, but a total of $1 trillion of announced investments. Now, again, announced is very, very different from what might happen in reality. But the point is that we're seeing a lot of activity. And again, that activity from a private sector standpoint is also fairly well distributed across the country. And so that becomes really important. Looking at job creation. The panel on the left looks at jobs in the electricity generation and supply. So again, in 2022, you see a rapid uptick in jobs in that sector. The left panel looks at job growth across the United States. So you can see in most states, you're seeing upwards of 3% to 4% job growth in the clean energy space. So tremendous amount of stimulus has really led to a lot of more work, more jobs, more opportunities in that area. Finally, talk about technology costs. We're seeing the graph is showing the difference between an EV and an internal combustion engine over time. And so what you can see is that early on, you're seeing the EV is not as favorable compared to the internal combustion engine, but over time that gap is going down. And when you have the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits in there, you're at the point now where you're almost even below tax rate. So it might even be cheaper for you to invest in an electric vehicle as opposed to an internal combustion engine. So that's exactly the type of thing that the legislators that passed it, the people that designed the act wanted to see. You want to see continued costs coming down. You also want to see that the economic incentives are such that it's going to provide and promote more adoption of electric vehicles. So what is key to sustaining this momentum? So the Inflation Reduction Act is only good for a 10-year period. At that point, the funds are up, and because it was passed through a reconciliation process, once that's up, you'd have to like extend the tax credits and the like. To keep this moving forward, it's really important that you have geographically distributed benefits of these investments, and that the tax incentives are also supporting some domestic manufacturing and promoting job growth. Now, there's two aspects of promoting job growth. So there's one aspect which is providing subsidies for domestic manufacturing, but there's also tariffs involved. And so there were, recently, and as of September, there were renewed tariffs continued to place on like solar panels and electric vehicles. So there's a bit of a tension there between wanting to decarbonize quickly, but then also providing enough domestic manufacturing and job growth. And that's sort of the fine line that we're walking here, is being able to provide the subsidies, but then you want to have some level of tariff to promote domestic manufacturing, but you don't want to completely cut off access to low-cost solar panels, because that might thwart the adoption of solar panels and also electric vehicles. There's also a bit of a tension with the clean energy supply chain. And a lot of this is, there's provisions in the act to kind of promote domestic battery manufacturing, and the concerns not only in the U.S. but also with other countries is you're concerned about foreign market power having and dominating these supply chains. And it's not only solar panels, but it's batteries, and there's a whole host of critical minerals, refining processes, and manufacturing processes that are seeing sort of a bit of a global imbalance. And that's a concern from a domestic standpoint, from a security of supply of providing clean energy technologies with a robust pipeline. And that is a little bit in tension with the subsidies. So a third area where a fourth area where the U.S. is really focusing on clean growth strategies, and that's incorporating climate impacts and transition risks into the federal budgeting process. And there's two sort of threads on this. One is to understand what the U.S. fiscal exposure is. So trying to look at projections of climate change and look at the amount of disaster relief that will need to be provided, the amount of crop insurance, and what that will cost the government from a fiscal standpoint. So that's sort of like one thread and one line of work. A second line of work is incorporating the stimulus policies and the physical risk and the transition risk into macroeconomic forecasts. So as the government is doing budget forecasting, they want to be able to understand, roughly what's the level of income, and then what's the level of tax revenues, and then these tax credits, they have to be accounted for somewhere. So that's fuel less revenue that's going into the government, but that's also spurring investment. And so when you're trying to do a macro forecast, it's important to understand the level of the budget deficit, but then you also understand where you're seeing increased investment. And there's been a lot of work done in this space. Jay Edmonds, Haywan has been involved in this from a long time. So this is something where we're trying to get a macroeconometric model to talk with integrated assessment models, and there are often not a lot of really good hooks, because the macroeconometric model doesn't really have the level of detail that you might like. On the other hand, the integrated assessment model doesn't really have the short-term dynamics that you might care about in terms of interest rates, changes in investment, looking at things like crowding out. So those are some things that are really important that we're trying to address within that framework, is to better understand how we might look at sort of short-term frictions on capital, labor, financial markets, as well as supply chains, and the impacts that might have on inflation and interest rates. And the two panels that I have at the right are sort of to just illustrate the care and the attention that need to be paid to in the top panel. So this is sort of like interest rates. And we can see that right now we are, interest rates are high in the US relative to recent history, but they are declining substantially. So that's important. The bottom panel is looking at the changes in the costs of inputs to manufactured goods. And so that's the percentage change year over year. And so there was a really high run up in costs over the last 3 to 4 years. That's finally going down. So we might have a little bit more stable prices. So what are the implications for integrated assessment modeling? So the diagram that I have on the right here comes from Karen Fisher-Vanden and John Wyatt on integrated assessment modeling. And they break out integrated assessment modeling into 4 big buckets of, large scale Earth systems, finer scale Earth system, which is sort of like land where critical minerals are. Then there's the physical infrastructure, and then there's also the socioeconomic systems. So the types of programs that we were talking about at the outset, this sort of fall well into sort of like urban infrastructure, agriculture, and forestry. So we kind of have that covered really well in the types of work that we're doing. In terms of natural capital accounting, like the natural capital accounting framework fits really well within our integrated assessment framework. Oftentimes, there's just a lot of work that the national governments need to do to better model and address and introduce national capital accounts to make that standardized. It's a very, very hard amount of work to value ecosystems. On the technology costs and supply chains, this is an area that I know there's a lot of ongoing work in this community, and there was a conference at JICRI a few weeks ago to kind of look at critical minerals and supply chain issues, and that touches on a lot of different boxes within the integrated assessment modeling community. So it touches on sort of the fine-scale earth system, so where are these critical deposits located? What are sort of the economic systems and the types of trade and supply chains that have to be developed? That applies into the socioeconomic and technical systems. But the pieces that at the level that we're often modeling these things at, when we're looking at modeling supply chains and we're looking at modeling rare earth elements and critical mineral manufacturing, there aren't a lot of suppliers out there, and there often aren't a lot of companies. So having a better system where we're actually looking at more fine-scale resolution, both from an industrial organization standpoint and from a resource standpoint, is really important to get this right and to provide that information to policymakers so that policymakers can adopt policies that aren't just as crude as tariffs, but can be a little bit more nuanced and deal with these supply chain issues and disruptions that might occur with a little more nuanced policy. Finally, on the climate macro standpoint, I know this community has done a lot of work with NGFS to provide that information to banks and things like that. But what we're seeing, at least from the federal government standpoint, is that decision makers are wanting to know things that have much more temporal detail than we currently often operate with, and that we're also really understanding the interactions between investment and interest rates, the banking community, and financial flows. And so getting more information and doing more of a deeper dive on that is going to be really critical, I think, to keeping a sustainable and sustained transition in the United States. That's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James. Within such a short time, he introduced U.S. version of green growth, and let's see the OECD European Rob, yeah, within 15 minutes. Okay.
Sure. I'll do my best for that, and otherwise just interrupt me. OECD is, by the way, not a European institution, even if we're in Paris. We have Korea as a member. We have US as a member. Anyway, if my slides can come up. So I can already start talking. And basically what I'm trying to present today is the international dimension of green growth, basically international trade and climate change. And we're doing something that's for us is new, and that is, I'm leading a team on trade and environment, and we talk to trade policymakers. We use a completely different jargon than when we talk to environment policymakers. And what we find is that they both understand different things, and they often, it's as simple as if you go to an environment policymaker, you talk about environmental policies. If you go to a trade policymaker, we're suddenly talking about sustainability-related measures or sustainability-related regulatory things. And it's like, these communities are very, very different. So what we're trying to do is do a report on the links between trade and climate change that is hopefully understandable for trade policymakers as well as environment policymakers. So then I thought, well, if that's the case, hopefully it's also understandable for all of you. So the idea is half of what you're going to hear from me is probably something that you already knew and that you're like, why are people repeating that? Everybody knows that. Trust me, there's another audience out there that doesn't know that. And there are things that you find, this is actually relatively new. And then we discover that other audiences find that very. So I'm going to talk, it's kind of broad and shallow, basically. That's what I'm trying to say. So there's a long-standing debate on how economic growth and the environment link together in green growth. And trade plays, of course, an important role in that. In the past, we've seen trade was a leading indicator of growth, and trade has been growing roughly 10–20% faster than GDP. But that has this idea of globalization has come under scrutiny, and it's also kind of stopped for at least a few years. It seems to be coming back, that trade is again a leading indicator of growth, but it's not clear yet. And And there's all kinds of international organizations that are also now trying to weigh in. So the OECD, for example, for I think 8 years, we were discouraged about talking by one specific country in particular, to talk about trade and climate change at the same time. We're starting to pick that up. The WTO is doing work on trade and climate change. So we're basically seeing new momentum there. And this momentum also comes at a time when climate policy is diversifying. We already had the Paris Agreement and everybody could basically nationally decide what they wanted to do. But what we're seeing really in the last few years is that the policy mix that countries are contemplating is very different. And I'm a CGE modeler. We used to love carbon taxes and we just put everything, oh, it's a regulation. Just put a carbon tax in there, it's roughly the same thing. Well, if you look at, I had Jim in an OECD panel a few weeks ago. He was talking about the IRA in detail. As a CGE modeler, I get very, very nervous about all that. So there's different climate policy instruments, different approaches that countries are using, and also the role of trade in decarbonizing industry is becoming more and more under scrutiny. And then finally, also, I want to look a little bit at the idea that trade patterns in a low carbon economy are different than the trade patterns that we have now. So this is probably the part where you're kind of familiar with. Climate change has effects on international trade through direct and indirect impacts, distortions to ports, extreme weather events that prevent transport, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's international economic activity. Transport is itself an economic activity that is leading to emissions and therefore contributes to climate change. There's also a link from trade policy to climate change through liberalizing trade in environmental goods, so trade-related goods. Electric vehicles is one example where we see a lot of trade happening, and that might contribute to climate change mitigation. Climate policy has international spillovers to international trade, not least carbon leakage. So, and finally, there are linkages between climate policy and trade policy there, and that we need to sort out also in terms of policy alignment. So in bold, you see 3 items that we're focusing on, which basically selected deep dives, we call them. One is on carbon leakage, one is on green hydrogen, and one is on low carbon trade patterns. But first, so trade is a source of resilience against climate impacts. So climate change affects the economy in different ways, and that disrupts production and consumption. And trade can stabilize prices. For example, if you have an extreme weather event that's in one region, you can import more from other regions. This is especially important for things like food, that if there's a food shortage, you can import food from elsewhere and stabilize prices like that. But also trade, if you have sustained climate change, trade can play a role in adjusting the patterns of production to adjust to climate change, and therefore trade provides a resilience against climate impacts also in the long run. But of course, the role of trade diminishes with climate change. Think about crossing all kinds of tipping points where you have these massive changes to our economies, and then suddenly we're not talking about, oh, you can just import from somewhere else, or you can have trade as an adaptation measure, because we're just way beyond that then. So the role of trade diminishes with more climate change. I'm going to speed this up. Trade is sometimes leads to increased emissions and sometimes can lead to reduced emissions. I think this is fairly obvious. So I'm going to skip that and really go on to the trade. So this graph, which is probably not very clear, in the dark blue, and look at the most right-hand side, that's 2021. The dark blue part is complaints from countries to other countries about subsidies that countries put in place. This is pre-IRA, just saying. And this is what countries have problems with. And this is the whole idea of the trade community, right? Because I come from an environment policy perspective, and we say, yeah, but you need to do your domestic policies in order to achieve your domestic policy goals. Yes, but you should also have fair and unbiased trade patterns, right? You should also make sure that you have a level playing field with other countries. You cannot just give a subsidy to your domestic producers without doing anything about imports, etc. So there's disputes. Now the WTO doesn't work perfectly, so lots of these disputes you get these notifications, and then not necessarily a lot happens. So then on carbon leakage. So I think also you're mostly familiar with that, and that is the idea of there's an unintended spillover from climate policy. You have an intended impact with higher emission costs for polluting firms and higher prices for emission intensive products. So on the left, the higher emission costs lead to a lower viability of those polluting sectors, but you get an increased economic viability of low carbon production. Basically, the ICE vehicles get more expensive, and which creates incentives for electric vehicles. On the right, you have higher prices for emission-intensive products, and therefore product substitution and demand reduction towards lower emissions. Basically, industrial products become more expensive because they're emitting, and you get more services. And this leads to emission reductions. But what happens with these higher emission costs for firms is that there's also an international trade effect, and that is the competition with foreign. So if you're the only one that implements that, you get an unintended impact that basically some of this economic activity shifts to other countries. And this is what we've seen in the past, that countries basically try to clean up their production systems, especially in OECD countries, clean up production systems by just importing the dirty stuff. But that was not me, no. By increasing production and increasing imports, and that leads to higher emissions in other regions. On the other side, about the higher prices for emission-intensive goods, you also have a trade impact that reduces domestic emissions, but not necessarily international emissions. So the global emission reductions are clearly lower than, can be lower than the intended domestic emission reductions. I'm going to skip this and just go directly to our main messages on this. So first of all, understanding the multiple channels of carbon leakage can improve the contributions of trade to climate change mitigation. So we all know about this international trade effect that I just explained, that you get production shifting to other countries, or just the competitiveness of your domestic industry reduces in favor of foreign competitors. There's the energy channel that's well known also here by probably most people here that do modeling. You know that these climate policies have an effect on fuel prices, and then other people that demand fuel see lower prices and thus demand more fuel, and you get an increase in emissions. But there are also spillover effects, and kind of what we call negative carbon leakage. I don't like the term, I prefer positive spillovers. And that is, for example, if you're the first one to create low carbon technology, Denmark is a good example with wind turbines. You create wind turbines that are competitive, and then suddenly the whole world can use these nice wind turbines. And so it reduces the cost of mitigation then abroad, and that could lead then to lower emissions abroad. And finally, the one that's very interesting from a policy perspective, but also very difficult to quantify, is policy diffusion. And that's the idea that if you do a mitigation policy, you might persuade others in response to also have a mitigation policy. I think, personal opinion, the EU is maybe trying to do something like that with the CBAM, seeing, well, if we implement a CBAM, do we get other countries to sign up to carbon pricing and increase their mitigation policies as a way to kind of avoid the CBAM? I think the EU would love it if the CBAM did not exist and there was a global ambitious climate policy. Again, that's a private opinion, not an OECD one. So the risk of carbon leakage is substantial. The ex-ante modeling work seems to suggest that there is at least pockets of leakage. Ex-post studies haven't found it yet, but I think the term there is really yet. We're seeing higher carbon prices now, and with that, probably also empirical literature coming up that does show some pockets of carbon leakage. But you really have to go into the details. So at the OECD, for example, we're now doing this at the firm level to really look at the firm level of what happens to carbon leakage, which is much more meaningful than broad economic sectors. I think I did myself 12 years ago or so, some study with like 25 sectors of the economy, and you don't see anything happening because these sectors are just way too wide. So finally, international cooperation is needed to prevent fragmentation of carbon leakage and mitigation policy measures. The idea that the EU is having CBAM, Australia is considering doing something similar, the UK is thinking of doing something similar, even in the US there are discussions on doing something similar. That's okay, but there's two problems with that. One is, can developing countries keep up with all that? And the second one is, are we going to get all these different systems that are not interoperable, and where firms that want to apply in one region for a CBAM exemption, can they also apply it in another region, or do they need to go through all sorts of regulatory hoops again and again and again? And the latter is, of course, very problematic. Then clean hydrogen. So there's international organizations. I think most people here probably have a more skeptical view of clean hydrogen. Maybe not all of you, but the modeling studies that I've seen have fairly reasonably low potentials for hydrogen. International agencies, IRENA, first and foremost, but also the IEA, see a massive contribution of hydrogen in a carbon neutral economy, up to 500 megatons, which is quite a lot. And of course, the only way that would work in practice is if we have decent trade in hydrogen. Now, we can't have decent trade in hydrogen. That's easy because hydrogen is not so easily transportable. So you need to then make derivatives. So this is the idea that you use ammonia to ship international, to fuel international shipping. And that is indeed one of the major ways in which you can do that. So IRENA, the graph on the right shows IRENA showing that there might be massive imports of hydrogen derivatives to the EU. Other people are maybe a little bit more skeptical about that. But certainly what's happening is that basically this can only happen if we have decent trade that facilitates this clean hydrogen. So trade can help achieve economies of scale to overcome investment gaps and high costs. Basically, the idea of clean hydrogen is that you use solar energy to then convert that to hydrogen, then convert that into ammonia, then ship that around the world, and then use that to create energy. It is very complex and very indirect and not necessarily very efficient from an energy perspective, but it does allow us to decarbonize parts of industry and parts of the economy that are hard to abate. So there is a gap, but it does need economies of scale. And removing trade barriers will be important because under WTO, it's not easy. There are standards emerging now on hydrogen, which is a good thing because that allows us then to understand better how these trade flows might work. And finally, trade cooperation can help develop international hydrogen markets and trade corridors. We see a lot of memorandums of understanding between countries on hydrogen. We don't see anything yet in international, in regional trade agreements, to my surprise. The trade agreements that are being conducted do not necessarily have a lot to say about hydrogen, but it's all in technical memorandums of understanding. So it's currently at the more technical level, and it will probably then gradually phase up to regional trade agreements and eventually potentially even the multilateral system. So then the carbon neutral future trade patterns. So this is the kind of long-term modeling work. So first and foremost, when we talk about the impacts of climate change, we have to think about this in relative terms. If all countries are affected by climate change, you're all negatively impacted by climate change, but you're less impacted than your competitors, you can still increase your competitive position and reap a comparative advantage. And this is what you see in this slide, and it's probably all not very readable, but basically other countries on the left of the chart in the red circle or oval, they have imports decreasing less than exports. So they're basically reducing their imports, but they're reducing their exports more. So they're losing their competitive position on the international market because they're hampered by climate change. The ones on the right don't see that difference, or see actually that exports, they can even increase exports in some cases. So the idea is really when you talk about things like trade impacts, climate impacts and effects on trade, it's really about the relative position of countries rather than the absolute impacts. Then the trade effects of climate policy. We did a very quick, almost out of time, I imagine. Yeah, this is my second to last slide. So the trade effects of going to a net zero economy in Korea. We thought it would be an interesting case study for this audience and for this conference. So what do you see happening on the export part is that energy, of course, gets lower. The blue bars are if you only do a domestic policy, and the orange bars if the policy, a similar policy is adopted in all countries. So start with the blue ones. For exports, you see a big decrease in energy, and you see a decrease in energy-intensive industry because those are the polluting industries. They get more expensive, and you export less of it. Makes a lot of sense. But if you then compare that to the global policy, and I want to focus here on the emission-intensive trade-exposed industry, EITE column, then you see that in a global policy, actually there is this competitiveness effect again, and we foresee, this is one modeling study, so I wouldn't buy shares, but you see that the energy-intensive industry can actually increase its exports from Korea to the rest of the world just because it is cheaper to basically produce it in Korea and then export it than to produce it abroad. On imports, a very similar story, but mostly the opposite, except for energy. And the reason for energy is that just that the domestic demand scales down so much that basically you have just much less energy demand and therefore also less imports. So the main messages here are, one, open door, trade in energy will decrease significantly. One on emissions intensive goods, and I think that's not an open door, and I think that's something that we need to keep in mind again, that trade effects are not necessarily directly proportional to emission intensity. And finally, when we want to have a role for international trade in a carbon neutral economy, we need to decarbonize transport, right? And part of that is just a switch to services, and digitalization is a major effect here, but it could also be hydrogen for maritime shipping, electric vehicles, etc. So we need to clean up transport as well in order to reach net zero emissions globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. You mainly touch upon the linkage between climate change and the trade issues. Our final speaker from Korea, Professor Jiyong from KAIST.
Thank you so much. So while my slide is being uploaded, so as one of the founding members of Korean Energy Modeling Forum, I'm very excited to see the IMC is finally held here in Seoul, and also very proud to see that the event is held in Yonsei University, where I did my undergraduate study. While academic exchange is very important piece of this kind of convention, I would highly encourage you guys to enjoy as much of the flavors and sights of Korea, especially while you are staying here in Sinchon area. Sinchon area is one of the most vibrant and also the youngest part neighborhood in Seoul. So when I was thinking about what to present at this green growth session, I could have presented the long 20-year long history of Korean green growth, but I chose to probably it would be useful for IMC community to start to think about how to assess how feasible the ambitious climate scenarios are by looking at the historical decarbonization trends. So this is kind of very narrow definition or narrow application of green growth, the trends, and also the presentation today. This exercise, I hope this can provide one example of how empirical research can inform or can be used to assess the feasibility of climate scenarios. So here is an introduction. So over the past few decades, countries have seen varying degrees of decoupling. So relative decoupling, absolute decoupling, and this decoupling seems to arise from a shift in public and political priorities toward environmental health as their quality of life improves. And also this decoupling trend is achieved through structural shift in economy and enhanced energy efficiency and supportive policy measures. And this relationship can be best illustrated through this EKC, the famous EKC curve. But I found only a limited number of studies have explored how climate policies contribute to shifts in carbon emissions within the decoupling framework. So So I try to the model the GDP emissions relationship by capturing socio-economic development and also the impact of climate policies. So this shows the carbon intensity trends, carbon intensity of GDP trends over the income levels. As you can see, is decreasing. Okay, so this is not very surprising. But what is surprising is that it is decreasing at a different rate. So when we express this trend in terms of logarithm of income, GDP per capita level, you can see even more vivid the gap or variation across countries in terms of their rate of carbon decarbonization or rate of decrease in carbon intensity of GDP over time. And we can express the same trend in terms of normalized carbon intensity of GDP normalized to 2020 levels. As we can see, the huge variation in terms of the rate of decrease in carbon intensity of GDP over time over the last several decades. So, and then this is the same figure. This is average growth rate of carbon intensity. As you can see, in general, the higher income countries tend to have higher or faster progress in terms of carbon intensity, whereas lower income countries tend to have lower progress in terms of carbon intensity. However, there are lower income countries showing fast progress over time, and high income countries showing slower pace of improvement over time. So this led us to actually question how has the progress of GDP emissions decoupling varied among countries at different stages of economic development, and how effective climate policies are in driving this kind of transition, and what insights do empirical models offer about the future of decoupling compared to IPCC AR6 scenarios. So these are the variables I used for the regression model. As you can see, there are policy variables came from Environmental Policy Stringency Index from, I guess, OECD, and ranging from 0 to 6 in terms of policy ambitions. It covers ETS and R&D expenditures, and also the subsidies for the renewable sources. And also it covers all the other socioeconomic development variables as well, and also most importantly, the logarithm of carbon intensity. Here is the panel regression model that I used. I have used many different versions of panel regression models, trying to understand the impact of the climate policy stringency on the progress of carbon intensity, and how that impact might interact with the income levels of each countries. And here are the model results. So first, model 1 is showing that so ETS is obviously actually decreasing. The effect of ETS is negative, meaning that ETS can help decrease the carbon intensity of country over time. And also we also tried the particulate matter control policy and green R&D policy and solar and wind subsidy policy, etc. But we haven't found any statistically significant impact of that policy on carbon intensity of GDP. So we tried also the interactive versions of the model, interacting that policy variables with per capita income, and we thought that probably model 2 is the one that is the ETS interacted with the per capita GDP, might be the one that we need to we can use to project the future of carbon intensity for individual countries. So as you can see, effect of ETS is negative, and also ETS interaction between ETS and per capita GDP is positive, meaning that as ETS, the policy stringency in particular in terms of ETS increases, carbon intensity of GDP would decrease. However, the rate at which it decreases is diminishing with this per capita income. All the other control variables actually worked in the anticipated direction, so which actually is good sign for us. So we ran basically 40 countries over 30 years, and we got this. We chose probably model 2 is the one we need to choose. Having identified the structure of carbon intensity progress over time, so we use this model to project the 13 world biggest emitters, how their carbon intensity might progress over time. And we compared that projection results with IPCC AR6 scenarios, two groups of AR6 scenarios, one C1 from C1 to C3, indicating high emission consistent with Paris Agreement. And C2 to C8 is the case where we don't have any meaningful ambition or even no ambition at all toward 1.5 degree stabilization target. Okay, now let me guide you through some of these exercise results by country. This is results for China, and the top two panels shows 2030 carbon intensity decrease relative to 2020. And the left-hand side is the one without any meaningful ambition or current policy case, whereas the right-hand side is the one we have very ambitious the climate target and also implementation going on. And also bottom two is showing that the distribution of our projection and also IPCC scenarios by 2050. And similarly, the left-hand side is the current policy case, and right-hand side is Paris Agreement consistent emission case. So as you can see overall, so I can go over this. This is for where is it? USA, India, Russia, Japan, and Korea, and Indonesia, and Canada, Brazil, and Mexico, and Turkey, and South Africa. So all of these things are actually showing us that, okay, the first, probably the IPCC scenarios actually presents a much faster decrease in carbon intensity than what is indicated by empirical projection, the interpolation of carbon intensity. And especially, but however, they agrees more closely, they aligns more closely when we talk about current ambition. Okay, so these projections and IPCC scenarios relatively agrees better when we talk about current ambition. However, when you talk about the Paris consistent ambition, they show stark, remarkably different patterns. But even that is the case for the case of Paris ambition. By 2030, we have some countries showing relatively better agreement between scenarios and projections, such as Korea and Mexico and Russia. Those countries seem to show relatively better agreement between scenarios and projections. Okay, let me conclude. So we built empirical GDP emissions decoupling models that takes into account socio-economic development and varying climate policy intensity across countries. And based upon this model, we projected GDP emissions decoupling of major carbon emitters to assess the feasibility of IPCC AR6 scenarios. And our analysis showing that IPCC scenario presents faster decoupling than is indicated by experience-based projections. And also IPCC scenarios align more closely with the projections when current policy intensity continues. However, a significant discrepancy exists when efforts align with the Paris target. So the final message here is that, okay, so meeting the Paris target demands faster transition than countries have managed so far, emphasizing the need for significantly greater policy ambition and effectiveness to make these goals achievable. And this example, this one exercise shows how we can maybe utilize empirical study to inform the feasibility of IPCC scenarios. Thank you so much. This is all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Professor very interesting comparative analysis on carbon intensity. Even if we are a little bit behind the schedule, I think we can have one or two morning comment or question to speakers.